Hello, this is Mr. Smith, and this is the Econ 3 Business and Labor Unit with Academic Economics, and this is part 2 of the lecture. So today I want to talk about market structure, and this is how we categorize different industries because they don't exactly all react the same when it comes to competition and how they react with supply and demand and what type of companies are going to be involved. Everything is a little bit different about each 4 of these categories. And from the screen here, you can see the chart. When we have more competition on one end of the spectrum and less competition on the other end, we can see at the bottom part of this chart, there's less concentration. So it's decentralized, and then more concentration, more of the business activity happening in one place on the other end of the spectrum. And at least one of these words should be familiar, monopoly, because you learned about them in 10th grade. This is when one particular corporation or business dominates an entire industry and is often the only supplier of a good or service. However, just like with a lot of things we talk about with human beings, including in economics, is that there's no such thing as perfection. So even though this one says perfect competition, there's really no such thing as completely perfect. And then there's also no such thing really as a completely perfect monopoly in the private sector. Really, the only thing that does have a monopoly usually is the government. The government has a monopoly over the police. The government has a monopoly over the military. And if you live within a city, for instance, it has a monopoly over the water and sewage. Or it hands out monopoly rights to companies. Like, for instance, Armstrong Cable, currently in the year 2020, has a monopoly on cable TV providers within the city of Titusville. And the reason why they do that is because in a community, you don't want 20 different systems of cables crisscrossing the town, so you only give a license really to one of them. So really, in the private sector itself, completely private, there's never really such a thing as a 100% monopoly outside of, in a small town, there's only one provider of a good or service. But we'll talk more about that later. So each of these other ones, monopolistic competition, this one might get confusing with monopoly, but monopoly is one. Monopolistic competition means there's multiple competitors. It's not the same thing. We'll talk about why that is. And then this one is often hard to pronounce, oligopoly. And the ola part, O-L-I, means few, kind of like in government. And oligarchy is when there's a small group of people, like an aristocracy or a military control over a country. And ola means few, and so in this case, it means few competitors. So many that are identical, many that are similar, few producers, and one producer is the spectrum of market structure. So let's first talk about perfect competition. And perfect competition has a few different major characteristics. First of all, the important one to remember is there's a large amount of buyers and sellers. So there's a number of firms or businesses. Second, that there's no artificial restriction. So, and this relates to the one right across from it, free entry and exit. Compared to other businesses, it's easy to get in and out of this industry. Now, of course, using that phrasing often makes people irritated, especially business owners, because they say, whoa, there's no such thing as an easy business. That's true, but remember the way I said it, it is easy to enter and exit this marketplace, this industry, compared to others. So it is easier to have a business in a perfectly competitive market than it is in monopolistically competitive oligopoly or monopoly. Usually, the other aspects depend upon the individual business, but homogeneous product means it's identical. So as close as you can get to identical as possible. Perfect knowledge of prices and technology, so there's nothing really a secret, and obviously part of that is because there's identical products. Everybody has the same products. Everything's going to be pretty much known about it. No transportation costs. Now this one is a little bit different because obviously that's not always true, especially if you have to get a good or service one place to another. The reason why this is here is because the closest we can get to a perfectly competitive marketplace, for instance, is the stock market. Shares of stock are shares of stock. They are ownership, a certain percentage of a company. Before we went digital, there was, for instance, a slip of paper that said this is the amount of stock. It was all the same no matter what. There wasn't really any difference. And so in that case, those are just being traded back and forth on the New York Stock Exchange, so there's no transportation costs. But obviously that's not always true. In fact, remember, there's no such thing as a truly perfectly competitive market. So some of these might be a little bit different. And so, for instance, perfect knowledge and prices and technology. Once again, business owners would object and they say, hey, wait a minute, I might be in a perfectly competitive marketplace, but I didn't know everything. Well, that's true, but it's easier to access than it is in the other marketplaces, is the point that we'll try to make here. And sometimes economists, instead of using the word perfect here, they just refer to this as the competitive marketplace. Kind of like the free market, we can just refer to that as the marketplace because it's not perfectly free. In at least every country, there are some types of laws that restrict economic activity. So, looking at perfect competition, and with each of these, we're going to keep in mind that there is the quantity produced of goods and services on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, price. So that's going to work the same way as the supply and demand charts. And here we're looking at marginal cost. Now, we talked about this before. This is the increase in cost for each additional unit that's produced. And the average total cost, so taking the total cost and dividing it by the quantity produced. And so here we can see those two curves. And then we also have marginal revenue, so how much is being charged for each additional unit. And then the demand, which here is also going to be the same as average revenue and price. In the short run, it is possible for an individual firm, a business, to make an economic profit. So in a perfectly competitive marketplace, it is possible when you first get involved, you get your name out there, you're selling your product, that it is possible to make a profit. You can charge a little bit more than what is going on in the rest of the marketplace. In the scenario shown in this diagram as the price or average revenue denoted by P is above the average cost denoted by C. So here we can see P, which is part of demand and average revenue. This is, of course, above, most of the time here, is above the average cost, which is this ATC, average total cost. And we can see throughout this range that the demand is higher, so it is above that. When we, of course, are going back to the previous lesson, please remember that whenever these two intersect, marginal cost and average total cost, that is typically when we start to see the average total cost increase quite a bit. And so it's going to increase dramatically after that point. Here we can see a case where it is possible to make an economic profit for a perfectly competitive market in the short run. Firms typically set marginal revenue to equal marginal cost. And you can see that is here marginal revenue, and this is marginal cost. They intersect there. And so that is the quantity that they're going to be able to produce. And notice, though, that when the quantity then intersects the demand curve, which is this curve here, you'll get this high of a price. And as long as they are having a price higher than the average total cost, they're going to be able to make a profit. Notice in the long run case, it's a little bit different. Remember, in the long run, the demand or the average revenue and marginal revenue are going to be this flat horizontal line. In the long run, economic profit cannot be sustained because what happens is when you are making this profit in the short run, lots of other businesses or firms say, hey, we'd like to start selling this thing too. And so once they do, they flood the market and it levels off this demand and also the price. And whenever that happens, notice that things are a little bit different now. As opposed to before, the demand curve was way up here above the intersection of the marginal cost and marginal revenue. But here, that's different. Marginal revenue and marginal cost are intersecting here. That's right where the demand is and the price. And then the average total cost, notice, is going to be higher at all points beyond that. And so if they end up going above this, they are going to end up losing customers or charging way too much. And if they go below that, they're not going to meet enough to make their costs, and they're definitely not going to have a profit. And it's not going to be profitable for them accounting-wise or economically. When we look at the actual demand curve for a firm in a perfectly competitive market, we have these two graphs here. This is the marketplace, and this is the firm itself. The demand curve for an individual firm is equal to the equilibrium price of the market. And so we can see this here. It intersects the same place where it is for this entire industry. So think of this as the entire industry, and this is for individual business. So for the entire industry, supply and demand is where we're going to see the equilibrium price, and demand for that individual firm is going to be this horizontal line. The market demand curve is downward sloping because of the law of demand. As price goes up, if it goes up, then demand is going to be lower. So this is the high point where there is a low quantity demanded of that product. And then the opposite is true. Whenever the price is low, the quantity is also going to be extremely high because more people are going to want to buy that product. Because there are so many producers of identical products, though, anybody that raises their price above that is once again going to lose customers, and anybody that lowers their price below that is not going to be able to make enough to get by. And so everybody's kind of trapped in this area. And so hence we have this horizontal line for individual firms, and they really can't change anything about that. And because of that, you're also going to have the same amount that is demanded no matter what. And so basically the point is that we refer to perfectly competitive marketplace businesses or firms as price takers. They have to go with whatever the marketplace dictates. So wherever that price is where their price is going to be, and that's going to be the same as their demand curve. This is because individual firms, because as I said before, they could lose out either way, they're just going to go with whatever basically the customer wants to pay. So that's why they're price takers, and that's why this is a horizontal line. They don't really have much of a choice. They have to go with what the demanders want. So some things that we take in consideration when it comes to this marketplace. Output is one and revenue is another. In economics, output is the quantity of goods and services that a producer makes over a certain period of time, whether it's a month or a year or whatever. And we look at output when it comes to individual firms, when it comes to entire industries or marketplaces or an entire country. And output can be taken as a consumer good, which means it's bought by individual households, or it can be used for further production, so maybe it's bought by other firms. Output is an important part of a variable for a business and on a national scale because it's output, not large sums of money, that makes a company or country wealthy, because you have to have something to make that money with. Revenue is also known as turnover, and it's the income that a company basically takes in. So this is the money that a firm makes through its normal business activity. So how much cash is it taking in? For example, this picture here, the donuts that they're selling. So this is usually from the sale of goods and service. And revenue is the money that's made because of output. And so this is because of the goods produced. Companies can receive revenue from other areas, interest charged from loans, for instance, or royalties, fees that are paid. Now, the Trump Organization, for instance, they don't own all their own properties. They often sell the trademark right to use the Trump name on buildings, so they collect fees from those buildings that use the Trump name. Those are big examples. And revenue often refers to the business income in general that is made, but it can also refer to the amount of money made during a specific time period. So when companies produce a certain quantity of a good or the output of it, revenue is the same amount of income made from the sales during the same set period of time. And so businesses look at revenue in any of their financial statements. So how a company performs is determined by its revenue or asset inflows. And they compare it with their outflows, their expenses. And so obviously they want their revenues or their inflows higher than their expenses or outflows. And revenue is an important indicator because obviously if it is greater than the expenses, then you're going to have a profit. So whenever we talk about the cost, once again, we look at it through the scope of marginal cost, which is the change in cost for each additional unit produced. And we can see the sloping curve that takes place here. And once again, as we go with economies of scale, we're producing on a larger and larger level, basically able to save more money from making bulk purchases of our ingredients. But then over time, of course, maybe we bought up all the ingredients in the area, and so we need to send away for ingredients, so it's costing more and more and more in order to bring together everything we need to make for a business. So you have increasing returns because you have a lower cost, but then that starts to diminish And eventually you get to a point where the cost is just going up and up and up until you have negative returns. You're actually, because of the cost, not able to make ends meet, and you're going to end up going in the hole. So it isn't as simple as, hey, let's just make more. That doesn't happen, and it's mathematically proven through graphs like this. In marginal revenue, the reason why this line is flat is because the change in the amount that you're making per unit is just going to be the same price over and over again. So if you're charging $50 for a pair of shoes, the first unit of shoes that you charge is $50. The second unit you're charging is $50. The third unit you're charging is $30. So it's the same. So this marginal revenue is going to be a horizontal line. This is margin profit maximization, and this shows the marginal cost perspective, and this is over the long run. Here we can see, once again, the demand, which is equal to marginal revenue. Remember, this isn't a perfectly competitive marketplace, which is why this is this horizontal line, and marginal revenue and demand are the same. And this is the marginal cost, so this curve here that we saw before, and this is the average total cost. And whenever we have marginal revenue equals marginal cost, the firm is going to look and see, oh, are we going to be able to make any more than this? And so logically, producing up till the point of marginal revenue equals marginal cost is good, but then above that, of course, becomes infeasible. So marginal cost, marginal revenue, and then if they continue producing more, notice that they'll be getting more expensive than average total cost. Remember back from a few slides ago, we don't want to go over average total cost. So wherever marginal cost and marginal revenue are equal, producing anything beyond that, any new quantity, so if we produce here, then we're going to have something greater than the average total cost, and it's going to continue to be true throughout this line. And so that's part of the problem, is that whenever you end up producing too much, especially with a perfectly competitive marketplace, you're eventually going to reach a point where you're going to reach maximum profitization. And so you're not going to be able to, or at least it's not feasible. You can still produce if you want to, but it's not feasible to produce more after that point. And the reason why that is because if marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, which is the case above this line here, then we have a point where the firm is actually taking a loss on each additional product it sells. And so a firm might implement a production shutdown if the revenue from the sale of goods produced cannot cover the variable costs of production. And that's exactly what's happening at this point. It's no longer able to do that, and so it might actually have to shut down. And once again, we could be talking about over months, a quarter, a year, any of those types of lengthier amounts of time. Whenever they decide to do that, when they decide to shut down, it's often a temporary decision. It doesn't automatically mean that they're going out of business. If the market conditions to improve because prices increase and production costs fall, the firm can reduce or resume production again. So shutdowns are usually a short-run decision. For example, places that serve ice cream solely, or places that don't have any sit-down areas, that are in a temperate climate that turns cold during the winter, they aren't going to be able to bring in enough business, and so they can continue to produce, but they're not going to make enough sales, and their variable costs are going to continue to go up because now they're also providing heat inside wherever their employees are working and so on. And so it just makes sense to temporarily shut down the facility. Now, does that mean individual owners of City Limits or Dairy Queen sits down and charts out one of these graphs? No, of course not. It's common sense. It's just in more complex, larger businesses, it's obviously a little bit more complicated, and so the math might come into consideration in those cases. Whenever we're looking at whether or not we've reached profit maximization, we're going to take in consideration either total revenue minus total cost, which makes sense because revenue minus cost is what gives us profit, or a marginal revenue minus marginal cost perspective. Total revenue minus total cost recognizes that profit is equal to the total revenue minus the total cost. When a table of costs and revenue is available, a firm can plot the data onto a profit curve. The profit maximizing output is the one at which the profit reaches its maximum. And here we can see a graph that depicts profit maximization on a total cost curve. And here we can see the profit And you might say, wow, this is really low. Well, remember, it's the point basically in between. It's the difference between the total cost and total revenue. And so where we have the total cost lower than the total revenue, we can see that is where we have profit that is positive. And then once we go beyond that point, when total cost is greater than total revenue, is where we start to see it be negative. And the same is true back here. And now this, you might wonder, why is it back here? Well, remember, this is when the company's first starting out. And so they have their building put together and their equipment bought and all that. So they have a lot of fixed costs, but they're not necessarily making any money at first. And they have to maybe wait until they sell so many units of something to recover that cost. And so that's why there's also a negative profit back on this side. And then if we look at it from the perspective of marginal revenue and marginal cost, it makes sense once again that marginal revenue and marginal cost in these points here is when the revenue is greater than cost, so we're going to have profit maximization occur up to this point. And then after that, obviously cost is going to be higher than revenue, and so that makes sense of when you should stop productivity, because you're end up going to show a loss over the long run. And this is a short run supply curve. So in this graph, remember that marginal cost is the same as supply. And so basically, the short run supply curve is the marginal cost curve at and above the shutdown point. So right in through here. The portions of the marginal cost curve that are here below the shutdown point are no part of the supply curve. So just think of supply just as this here. And the reason why that is because the firm is not producing in that range. It's not going to be producing down here because that's lower than what they're going to be taking in. That just doesn't make any sense. So the short-run supply curve is used to graph a firm's short-run economic state. And so the graph shows this short-run supply curve in a perfectly competitive market. So remember, this is, once again, an industry with many producers of identical products where everything is known and so on. And so, once again, this is their supply curve up here. This below, they would not be producing at that rate because it would be lower than their cost. Now, this one's a little bit confusing, but this shows additional supply and the long-run supply curve. As the chart demonstrates, a market's long supply curve is the sum of a series of short ones. So each of these is a short one supply, and you'll notice that where you can draw a line in between the peaks of each, I guess this would be troughs, this is the bottom point, you can form this long-run supply curve. And the reason why these short-run supply curves show these steep drops then rises back up is because, once again, when they're producing at a high price, then the reason why they're like that is because the first items that are produced start out with a very high price. This is because it's expensive for a producer to manufacture one item, and they might charge a lot. The producer has to cover its fixed costs, such as equipment and training and all those other kinds of things when they first start out. And then once they start producing more, then of course the price is eventually going to drop. And then, as we talked about, after they get to a certain point of production, then costs are going to go back up. And so the price might have to be even higher as they start to produce more and more. So each of these, that's why they have these steep troughs in them. But once again, the intersection points here for the long run supplies, because those troughs are where you can find the marketplace supply over the long run. So in a perfect market, demand is perfectly elastic. And what that means is, when something is highly elastic, customers can, when it comes to demand, if the price changes a little bit, they're going to say, no, we're not going to buy that anymore. And so if you, as a producer, end up having higher prices, they're just going to say, no, we're not going to buy that from you. Because remember, they can go to many other places to buy it. So the elasticity is said to be perfect. It's perfectly elastic. So they're incredibly flexible. They're not stuck with you at all. The demand curve in this case also represents marginal revenue, which is important when we think about supply later on. So regardless of how much is produced by suppliers, the price will remain constant. It will remain the same. And this means infinite here, this little symbol. The quantity of butter produced and the quantity of guns produced. Guns and butter is a metaphor that economists use to signify the production of either domestic goods or military or foreign goods. That is, goods that are going to concentrate on foreign diplomacy and things like that. And the reason why we bring this back to your attention It's because this line, the production possibilities frontier, is the maximization of efficiency. So we're utilizing all of our resources as much as possible. And that's exactly what a perfectly competitive marketplace does. The opposite end of the spectrum that we looked at earlier in that first chart, monopoly, they're not able to maximize efficiency. They're not utilizing all of the resources of society properly. So a perfectly competitive marketplace fits in with Adam Smith's idea about capitalism. If there's lots of producers, everybody's competing, everybody's striving to improve, they're all fighting to get the customers because they have to take whatever price they're being given. And so that is making society as efficiently as possible. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that all the resources are being allocated to all the people and everyone has a good standard of living, but it does mean that you're having a lot of efficiency. Allocative efficiency is the degree to which the marginal benefits consumers receive from goods are as close as possible to the marginal cost of producing them. So the best level or optimum level of allocative efficiency in a given market, the last unit's marginal cost would be perfectly equal to the marginal benefit it provides consumers. So this results in no underutilization or inefficiency, also known as deadweight loss. So everything that was put into the cup, if it can be measured, is equal to the benefit or what you get out of that cup of coffee when it's taken out. Markets are not efficient if they are subject especially to things like monopolies, or if there are public goods provided, or price controls, or negative externalities. This means that the allocation is not being as efficient as possible. Allocative efficiency is the main means to measure the degree markets and public policy improve or harm society. So, for instance, we go back to this here. This means we're being efficient, but it doesn't signify that everybody has enough food. It doesn't signify if everybody's standard of living is going up. It doesn't signify if people are being educated and improving as human beings. That doesn't really take this into account at all. For instance, we could be as efficient as possible by cutting down every single tree that we have, digging up every single square foot of earth in order to mine. We would be incredibly efficient because we'll be using all of our resources, but that would lead to lots of negative externalities, including pollution, which could harm our health. So allocative efficiency is something else to look at besides just the efficiency of production. And so there are different standards to evaluate the concept of allocative efficiency. And the basic principle asserts that in any economic system, choices in resource allocation produce both winners and losers, relative to the choice being evaluated. The principle of rational choice, individual maximization, utilitarianism, and market theory further suppose that outcomes for winners and losers can be identified, compared, and measured. And so we look at all the people and how they're succeeding and how they're losing, and we compare and contrast those to determine if we're getting the most allocative efficiency we can out of the system. And that's another way that we realize that there are problems and how we can identify negative externalities and market failures, and whenever the people need to come together through government in order to address those issues. So under these basic premises, the goal of maximizing allocative efficiency can be defined according to some neutral principle, where some allocations are objectively better than others. For example, an economist might say that a change in policy increases allocative efficiency as long as those who benefit from the change, the winners, gain more than the losers. Of course, there are disagreements about that, because there might others that would say everyone should equally benefit and there should be no losers. But having no losers at all is often difficult and takes away even more from the production efficiency. So allocative efficiency and productive efficiency don't always normally correspond, especially if you get into more controlling measures to try to make everything be allocated equally, which is another reason why socialism or centralized control of an economy doesn't necessarily work. Barriers to entry, stopping businesses from coming in and out, which stops an industry from being perfectly competitive or makes it less competitive, would include the lack of capital. If you need a lot of money and assets to start up, such as equipment, buildings, and raw material. Customer loyalty. A large number of firms, especially have been around for a long time, have existing customers. And so being a new business and starting up in that industry is difficult to get your name out there and steal away some of those customers. Economy of scale. Sometimes it's difficult to mass produce to get to the point where your marginal revenue is going to be greater than your marginal cost. And so economy of scale is sometimes difficult for some new companies to catch up to. And then, of course, there's intellectual property, which is symbolized by this. And we want to be fair to new inventors, so that way they get to profit off of their inventions, or artists after their creations. So copyrights exist as well. And so we give them patents and copyrights, basically protecting their invention or their creation for a certain period of time. And that sounds good, and it is good in that way if it protects the little guy. But the problem is that big companies get these patents and copyrights too. And so whenever that happens, it also stifles competition in the meantime until the patent or copyright runs out. And so that can be another barrier to entry. And the other thing I'll mention is barriers to exit. And so sometimes it's a problem within a perfectly competitive market whenever we get to the point when the companies can no longer exit. Remember that to be perfectly competitive, entry and exit happens to happen pretty freely, but you can get to the point where that's more difficult. So what can cause a barrier to exit to hamper this idea of a perfectly competitive market? Well, if there's high investment in assets that you can't transfer, you can't sell equipment, you can't get rid of it, or land or something like that. High redundancy costs if a company has a large number of employees, or employees with high salaries, or contracts that continue to have to be followed through with, pensions that are outstanding. Other closure costs that can make them hesitant about shutting down, such as contracts with buyers and sellers. And then potential upturn. Firms may be influenced by the potential of an upturn in the market. And so maybe they were looking at leaving. And so all of a sudden there's a market increase and prices are going up. And so they go, oh, we'll stay in, but maybe that's short-lived. And so that can trick companies from exiting. But whenever these barriers to exit happen, it's not necessarily as truly perfectly competitive as it used to be, because in a perfectly competitive market, companies can go and come as they please. The next thing that I want to look at are monopolies. And here we can see all of the characteristics of a monopoly. A monopoly has full control over supply. They are the only company, the only firm. It itself is the entire industry. It can control the supply, so they can determine where supply and demand intersect and what the price should be. They are a price maker. It's very difficult to become a monopoly, and it's very difficult to start up as a new business to compete with a monopoly. And so there's barriers to entry. There's no close substitutes because they have this unique product, and they also have a downward sloping demand curve, which we'll look at in a little bit. And this is a demonstration of a monopoly. The demand curve, as you can see, is downward sloping. The production is going to take place where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. So that will be the quantity. So this is marginal cost. This is marginal revenue. So this is the quantity that's going to be produced. We'll talk more about this later. And some of the things about monopolies, monopoly power comes from the fact that they have economy of scale. They have a really large amount of production. Capital requirements. The reason why it's difficult to start up and compete in an industry that's already a monopoly is because there's a lot of startup costs. So capital requirements are huge. The monopoly often has technological superiority. There are no substitute goods available, so they control the entire supply. You can't go somewhere else to buy something. They might also have control over the natural resources that are necessary to make this particular product. And they can have a network of externalities, so side industries and other types of things that they control. And they might also have legal barriers that exist. Maybe they're given some kind of benefit by the government, and they could take deliberate actions to stop competition from occurring. And I just want to mention that companies can become more domineering through what are known as mergers. Vertical mergers are to buy the different steps in the production process. So if you're making steel, you buy the iron ore, you buy the coal, you buy the railroads for shipping, you buy all the different parts that you need in order to make the steel. Or you can participate in a horizontal merger, which is to buy other companies that are similar to you. So you have an oil company and you buy other smaller oil companies, then you become a medium-sized oil company, then you buy up other medium-sized oil companies, and you become bigger, and then you just keep up buying all the other oil companies as they come into existence. And so that is an example of a horizontal merger. And the other way is to become a conglomerate, which is to control many different unrelated parts of different types of industries, actually. And so that you just become more powerful and influential overall when it comes to wealth and politics and so on. And the reason why we have diamonds here is because for most of the 20th century, De Beers had a monopoly power over the world market for diamonds, controlling the supply, drastically driving up the prices, and they also convinced people they were necessary through their control over media and advertising, making people believe they were a necessity in order for engagement rings, which actually they didn't used to be before the 20th century. Large firms that attain economies of scale, in part because fixed costs are spread over more units or output. So you have massive amount of infrastructure needed for a particular business. You can spread out those costs in the large amounts of production that you have. So you have economies of scale. The Postal Service is an example of a government-endorsed monopoly. It is, of course, in charge of the mail in the United States. And so we often just refer to these as government monopolies, but as I mentioned before, that's where when you have the government providing a good or service, or you have them contract out to someone else. And then, of course, there's technological monopolies, which can include, mostly we're just thinking about patents, but under that general umbrella we might also put copyrights, although that's not technically technology. But these are certifications that the government gives in order to protect monopoly status. Once again, it's intended for the little guy, but actually it also ends up helping bigger corporations. And so here we can see we're comparing a monopoly to a duopoly, and never mind all this math here, but we can see that the total cost for one firm and the total cost for a second firm, this total area is going to be the total cost. Whereas for a monopoly, we only have this red shaded area. So the total cost, you can see here visibly through mathematics that the total cost for a monopoly is going to be much lower, which makes it more efficient necessarily in this one perspective when it comes to cost, but definitely not when it comes to the allocation of efficiency, which we talked about a little bit ago. So this is why some extreme capitalists, libertarians in particular, who don't believe antitrust laws are necessary, they actually say, well, big business monopoly is a good thing because look how much it can lower cost. And this, by the way, is also an argument why sometimes the government should leave it alone. And when we have the case of a natural monopoly, the total cost of a natural monopoly's production is lower than the sum of the total cost of two producers. So the reason why they might let it happen, for instance, going back to the cable example, if there were two producers of cable company, TV cable in Titusville, then they have two different sets of wire systems instead of one, and so that'd be more expensive to introduce and maintain, including the billing procedure, and both of them might have offices. And so it just makes sense if the total cost is lower by having one licensed cable TV provider, which would be Armstrong. So monopolies, of course, can exist once again when they have large amounts of control over natural resources. The diamond industry at one time was an example of that. Or if they have technological advantages like Facebook, for instance. Electricity distribution. The electrical infrastructure is expensive. And so there are few or no competitors for electric distribution. And this will sometimes create a monopoly unless people come together and create a cooperative, especially for rural areas, to introduce their own competition. And the government has tried to make sure there is more competition, but that doesn't always work out all the time because it's extremely expensive to industry to get into. In a monopoly market, the marginal revenue curve and the demand curve are distinct and downward sloping. Production occurs when marginal cost and marginal revenue intersect. So once again, it is right here, and this is the quantity that's going to be produced. So looking at the monopoly diagram, there are 5 key points. Marginal revenue lies below the demand curve. This occurs because marginal revenue is the demand plus a negative number. Second, the monopoly quantity equates marginal revenue and marginal cost, but the monopoly price is higher than the marginal cost. Notice the price here, and of course this is the marginal cost. Third, there is deadweight loss or inefficiency for the same reason that taxes or other types of government interference creates. The higher price of monopoly prevents some units from being traded that are valued more highly than they cost. Fourth, the monopoly profits from the increase in price, and the monopoly profit is illustrated here. Fifth, under competitive conditions, supply equals marginal cost. The intersection of marginal cost and demand correspond to competitive outcome. We see that monopoly restricts output and charges a higher price than would prevail under competition. And so marginal cost, where it intersects demand, this is where in a competitive market we normally see supply, so quantity would be out here. But with a monopoly, the quantity is going to be back here, which means they can charge a higher price. And that, of course, creates some inefficiency in the marketplace. And here we can see that illustrated by this yellow area. And this would normally be in a competitive market where we would see illustrated by a Q with a lowercase c for quantity of competition, where we'd see the equilibrium quantity and price. But when there's only one company, we have the quantity M here, quantity monopoly, and this is the supply that they're going to give, and this is the price, which is going to be much higher. So basically, all this is going to be lost out when it comes to efficiency, and so it's known as deadweight loss. Because now, the producer is going to be getting more out of this, but it's also cutting out all of the additional consumer surplus. Because the consumer surplus, this pink area, would actually be the whole way down to here inside a competitive market. So since they're losing out on this, they're eventually going to have what is known as deadweight loss. So the short-run equilibrium for monopoly, the gray box illustrates the abnormal profit, although the firm could easily be losing money. A monopoly is an imperfect market that restricts the output in an attempt to maximize profits. And of course, it's not shaded in gray, but the box that's indicated there would be the economic profit that is able to make, because it is basically reducing the quantity and receiving a higher price from that. And this shows more of the deadweight loss. The graph shows the deadweight loss, the yellow area, that a result of a binding price ceiling. So this would be an example of a ceiling, a maximum price that is established. Policymakers will put a binding price ceiling when they believe the benefit from the transfer of surplus outweighs the adverse impact of deadweight loss. So the government might impose some type of price ceiling in this situation, which means the price can go no higher than this. And so we have supply here and demand here, and obviously you're only going to want to have the producer wanting to supply this much at that price level. They're not going to want to supply as much, but more is going to be wanted by the people at this lower price. And so this is going to be a shortage that occurs because the demand is much higher than what is being produced. And so in the previous example, the monopoly where we have this deadweight loss occur, they're going to try to undercut that with government policy by establishing a price ceiling. So the market quantity with price ceiling is going to be here. This would be the equilibrium. And of course, if we go back to just the monopoly, the quantity that they're going to be picking is still going to be back here, which means they have a profit, but it also means that there's inefficiency because the consumer surplus is cut back on. So the policymakers are going to decide, well, it's better that we have this lower price and we get rid of this deadweight loss, even though we're just going to be producing the same amount and we're going to end up with some type of shortage. This is an illustration of price discrimination, which is a scheme that can be used to maximize profits. In a competitive market, price discrimination occurs when identical goods and services are sold at different prices by the same provider. In pure price discrimination, the seller will charge the buyer the absolute maximum price that he is willing to pay. Companies use price discrimination in order to make the most revenue possible from every customer. This allows the producer to capture more of the total surplus by selling the consumers at prices closer to the maximum willingness to pay. So they're looking for the high point. So for instance, wherever they're going to find here that the customer is willing to pay the most at. And so it might be different for different groups of people. And so they're going to find each of those points in order to charge and make the most money possible. An example of price discrimination that's shown here would be cost of movie tickets. And so prices at one theater are different for children, adults, and seniors. The prices of each ticket can also vary based on day and chosen showtime. Ticket prices also vary depending upon portion of the country as well. Industries use these price discriminations as a way to increase revenue. It's possible for some industries to offer retailers different prices based solely on the volume of products purchased. Price discrimination can also be based on age, location, and desire for the product and customer wage. And so when we look at these three areas here, this is for the entire industry. Or excuse me, this one would be for the older people. I say a movie doesn't really matter, so the prices are going to be lower in order to get them to come. And this is going to be for younger people who think going to the movies is necessary, so they're willing to pay a lot more for that particular product. A producer can charge price PA to its customers with inelastic demand and PB to those with elastic demand. So PA would be for those that think this is an absolutely necessary product, and so they're going to be able to maximize profit off of the older customers who might say, I really don't need to go to the movies. They're not going to be able to charge as high as a price, and so their price is actually going to be smaller. And then, of course, you combine both of these things for the entire industry. And this would be sales revenue. These graphs show the difference in sales revenue with and without price discrimination. The intent of price discrimination is for the seller to make the most profits possible. And so we can see this one is without price discrimination. So they just have one price and they're going to make a profit off of that. Or on the other hand, they're charging two different prices here and they're going to be able to try to maximize profits off of having those two different prices. So in these three cases, once again, they're going to try to find the best price discrimination areas possible. So they're going to plot out all these graphs, pick different pricing points to decide where exactly they should go with each of these different customer bases. And once again, inelastic submarket is where they're going to be able to get the most money out of, because these people, their demand is not that flexible. They're going to pay whatever they can in order to get that product. Whereas the elastic market, they're not going to be able to get that much money out of, because these people are flexible. They're going to say, I really don't need this. And so they're not going to be able to charge as much in that particular case. And this just goes back to perfect competition. This is a graphical illustration of economics within the context of a perfectly competitive marketplace, which is theoretical once again, because there's no such thing as completely 100% perfect competition. Note that the overall returns derived, costs incurred, quality produced, and price point all align perfectly to generate an equitable market position. While this is an idealistic representation of the market, it is useful as a frame of reference to identify departures from ideal competitive circumstances. So, this is the perfect situation, but once again, there is no such thing as perfect. But it helps us compare other industries or marketplaces to show the differences that occur. And the monopolistic effects on price. This graph illustrates the way in which monopolistic incumbents can control economic factors, ultimately creating surpluses or shortages to garner the advantage. So once again, the higher price, coming back to this is the quantity of the monopoly, and this would be the deadweight loss that occurs. That's just coming back to that previous chart. So now let's talk about monopolistic competition. Now that is not the same thing as a monopoly. A monopolistic competition is when there are many producers. So there's a large number of firms. And the reason why they're called monopolistic is because they have product differentiation. They produce similar products, but each of these products has a little bit different twist. So there's 100 manufacturers of blue jeans, but you have a specific style that only you have. And so in a way, you have your own little monopoly over your own type of blue jeans. So there is product variation. There can be heavy expenditure on advertisement because you need to go out there and convince people that your blue jeans are different. And because you do get this loyal band of people that will buy only your blue jeans, you can charge a little bit more than the marketplace. So you have some control over price. And just like perfect competition has a large number of firms, this monopolistic competition also has free entry and exit into the marketplace, at least compared to other industries. And so clothing is a good example of monopolistic competition because firms have differentiated products and some market power. And how do you get that? Of course, you do it through advertising and branding. So Kool-Aid is an individual brand that competes with Kraft's, for instance, other brands. So even within an industry, within an individual firm like Kraft, they might have different products that are basically the same, but they're a little bit different. So they can advertise them as that and make more money off of that. And so they can charge different prices for similar products. In monopolistic competition, as you can see from the chart, the demand curve, which is marked in red, slopes downward, signifying elastic demand. And the reason why that is because there are substitutes. There are different types of juices and fruit drinks that can happen. And so people are more willing to say, well, the price is going to go up. I can just go with something else. So I don't need to buy Kool-Aid anymore. So they're very flexible with their demand, which is represented by this downward sloping demand curve. The short-run equilibrium under monopolistic competition. As you can see from the chart, the firm will produce the quantity supply, which is QS, and where the marginal cost curve intersects the marginal revenue curve. So marginal cost and marginal revenue. And so this is the quantity that's going to be produced. And then we're going to end up where it intersects demand with the price level. The price is set based on where the quantity supplied falls on the average revenue curve, which is also demand. So once again, this is the quantity they're going to pick. The profit the firm makes in the short term is represented by the gray rectangle. And once again, there is no gray, it's not colored in. And that profit area is not shaded in as a rectangle, unfortunately, here. I don't know why it says that if it isn't shaded. But the upper line is going to be the price level, and the lower line is going to be where average cost intersects marginal cost. So right here. And so that very slim area is going to be the profit. And the reason why it's so slim is because they do have a little bit of control. Because if you're the producer of this special blue jeans, you can charge a little bit more, but not a lot more, because then you'll lose the customer, because their love of your particular design isn't great enough for them to pay an enormous amount of money. The long-run equilibrium of monopolistic competition. In the long run, the firm in a monopolistically competitive market will produce the amount of goods, or the long-run marginal cost, or LRMC, which is here. Curve intersects the marginal revenue, which is here. So once again, this is the quantity. The price will be set where the quantity produced falls in the average revenue curve. So once again, right here. The result is the long term, the firm will break even. And so if we look at the long run, which is just continually going out this way over time, we can see that the price level, which is right here, and the quantity that's produced, which is here, and so they're going to intersect here, and so that's the short run. Remember we looked at that before. Whoops. Short run, long run, not really any difference here. And so where those two intersect is also where they're getting that quantity from, is marginal cost and marginal revenue. But in the long run, if they keep producing, of course, you're going to see two things basically happen. They're going to have a surplus, as they're going to have a quantity eventually that is greater than what is demanded if they keep pushing this line out this way. So that's one thing that's going to happen. They'll have a surplus of supply. And in the long run, as they keep pushing that quantity out, it's going to get closer and closer to this price level. And remember, the difference is between this intersection point and the price level, but it's going to readjust to the long run average cost. And so when we get up to here, then that point is going to be even with the price level. So the economic profit that occurs is eventually going to evaporate. Once again, that's because if they start charging too much for their specific type of blue jean, for instance, they're going to scare away customers. So in the long run, you're going to scare away customers, so their demand is actually going to be very flexible. So just like a perfectly competitive marketplace, elasticity is going to be this flat line. There is some inefficiency, though, because like I said, in a way they're like a monopoly because they have a monopoly over their particular version of this product. And so we still end up seeing this dead weight loss occur whenever they produce, because they're going to produce perhaps at a quantity similar to monopoly. They're going to choose to charge that little bit higher price for their version of the jeans. And so they're going to be able to take away what could have been this area here, particularly back in here, would be the consumer surplus, the benefit the consumer would have if they were producing here at the equilibrium point. But instead, they're going to produce back here, and this is going to be the price where it intersects demand. And so this entire area is going to be dead weight loss or inefficiency. And so how do they do that? How do they convince people to buy more? Well, one thing I just mentioned was through advertising. Advertising and branding. A lot of people call mouthwash, for instance, Listerine, even if it's not the Listerine version, because that brand is just so cemented into people's minds, which is why often branding causes you the ability to charge a little bit more because you convince people that it's an incredible product. The next one that I want to mention would be oligopoly. And this is when there is a small number of producers, so there's few sellers. There is a lack of uniformity. So they do have similar products, but they have a little bit of a different twist, just like monopolistically competitive marketplaces, that they have their own version. And there are entry and exit barriers, usually because of high costs and infrastructure and setup and all that other kinds of things. They're extremely competitive with each other because they do have that lack of uniformity, and they do so also like monopolistically competitive markets with advertising. And so each of these companies has a little bit of independence, and so they are cutthroat competitors that will try to steal away customers much more severely and harshly with advertising and gimmicks and schemes and patents and any other mechanisms they can get to one-up each other. And so cell phone usage is a good example of that, and you see it a lot. They're very competitive, they're critical of each other, they put down each other's service and customers' care, and they really brag up, we have more coverage, more towers, this and that. And so cell phone service is an example of that. And so they try as much to differentiate their product. And there are differences, and there is better coverage or more access technology and all these other kinds of things when it comes to cell phone usage. But they have to get those types of innovations, that product differentiation, in order to steal customers away from each other. Advertising for that product differentiation is important. So some companies are able to use marketing to achieve product differentiation. And another example would be pop. I mean, there's very few producers of soda pop throughout the United States and the world. And of course, they do this by convincing that their brown sugar water is somehow different than the other brown sugar water. And it might be a little bit of a taste, but really a lot of that is done through the convincing of advertising. And another one would be airline manufacturing. There's very few producers, and this goes back to these barriers to exit and entry. It's extremely expensive to start up any of these. Cell phone providers because of the network of towers, pop producers because of the distribution network and the factories that make it, and then definitely the factories that are used to manufacture airline equipment. So that can be a problem as well. And then also not gas stations. Gas stations are not included with this, but the actual oil refineries and the networks of companies that provide gasoline, which are not the same necessarily as the companies that actually sell gasoline to you. Quick Fill is owned by the oil refinery in Warren, so that's one consideration that's a little bit different. But Sheetz buys its oil and gas from other places, and even though BP is an oil company, the BP locations aren't necessarily part of that corporation. They might be just franchisees, and they actually end up purchasing from a lot of different producers. So gas stations and the actual gas manufacturers are not the same. The gas manufacturers are an oligopolistic marketplace because it is expensive to try to get into the industry, to set up an oil refinery business and distribution system. And so there are also few producers of actual gasoline, as another example. And whenever we do have few producers that try to work with each other, they're known as a cartel. An example of a cartel would be OPEC. And it isn't necessarily the companies, but the countries involved in oil production. The oil-producing countries of OPEC have at times cooperated to raise world oil prices by agreeing to decrease supply. And this would be one of the few examples. One of the reasons why it doesn't always work and why some libertarians, some extreme conservatives don't think there should be antitrust laws is because they say, look, eventually in this case, these countries sell each other out. The price starts to increase when they decrease supply. So then Libya breaks off and starts selling more because they get greedy. So they point out maybe laws against cartels aren't necessary, but we've also seen evidence that goes the other way. And one of the economic theories that points out why that the cartels won't always cooperate with each other, the different oligopolistic members won't cooperate with each other, is because of the prisoner's dilemma. In a prisoner's dilemma game, the dominant strategy of each player is to betray each other, even though cooperation would have led to a better outcome. So the prisoner's dilemma is a specific type of game in game theory that illustrates why cooperation may be difficult to maintain. In the game, two members of a criminal gang are arrested and imprisoned. So we have player A and player B. The prisoners are separated and left to contemplate their options. If both prisoners confess, they will each serve a 2-year prison term. If one confesses, but the other denies the crime, the one that confessed will walk free, and while the other one denied the crime would get a 3-year sentence. If both deny the crime, they will both serve only a year sentence. Betraying the partner by confessing is the dominant strategy because you don't know exactly what the other one is doing. You're competitors in this scenario. And so it is the best strategy for each player regardless of how the other plays. This is known as the Nash equilibrium. The result of the game is that both prisoners pursue individual logic and betray when they would have collectively gotten a better outcome if they had cooperated. And so, you might have two companies that come together to have a meeting and say, hey, let's divvy up this industry or let's do this or that, but they won't trust each other and they won't give each other all the information. And if they can, they'll work around their agreement to try to make a bigger profit in some other way. And so eventually the agreement will fall apart. So the Nash equilibrium is an important concept in game theory. It is the set of strategies such that no player can do better by unilaterally changing his or her strategy. If a player knew the strategies of the other players, and those strategies could not change, and could not benefit by changing his or her strategy, then that set of strategies represents a Nash equilibrium. If any player would benefit by changing his or her strategy, then that set of strategies is not a Nash equilibrium. While the game theory is important to understanding firm behavior in oligopolies, it is generally not needed to understand competitive or monopolized markets. In competitive markets, firms have such a small individual effect on the marketplace it doesn't really matter. In a monopoly, a market only has one firm, and so thus strategic interactions don't actually occur. So this is really the most useful when it comes to oligopolies. And then, of course, there's duopolies. The diagram shows the reaction function of a firm competing on price. When price 2, the price set by firm 2, is less than the marginal cost, firm 1 prices at marginal cost. When firm 2 prices above the marginal cost but below the monopoly prices, firm 1 prices just below firm 2. When firm 2 prices above monopoly price, firm 1 prices at monopoly level. So think of it this way. In this Bertrand model, firm A's optimum price depends on where it believes firm B will set its price. So they're going to think, where is the other company going to price at? Pricing just below the other firm will obtain full market demand because we'll be selling our product for less, so we'll be able to make lots of money. Though its choice is not optimal if the other firm is pricing below marginal cost, because then that's a problem because you're not going to be able to cover your costs. So if they're charging a lot less than what your marginal cost is, you're not going to be able to cover your costs. And so in that situation, that's not optimal. That's not feasible. So if firm B is setting the price below marginal cost, firm A will set the price exactly at the marginal cost, and then it's just breaking even. If firm B is setting the price above marginal cost, but below the monopoly price, then firm A will set the price just below that of firm B. So if the monopoly price is way up here, and here's the marginal cost, they're going to put it just below that so they can maximize prices, not just covering their costs. They're going to be able to make a lot more money than that. And then, of course, there's antitrust laws. And these attempt to stop organizations from either being monopolies or being oligopolies. And if one oligopoly does cooperate together, then you basically have a monopoly. If you have 3 or 4 companies working closely together, they're going to be working the same as one company. And so antitrust laws were introduced once you had the captains of industry, or some people call them the robber barons, started to form large corporations U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, and so on, or there were cartels formed between sugar producers and copper producers and so on that were known as trusts. And so antitrust legislation was basically established to stop this because as part of the Gilded Era, these companies and trusts grew into big behemoths and started to dominate industry and started to squeeze out competition and charge a lot more for their prices, and in some cases get rough with the people that provided the goods and services, or the resources and labor to these industries. And so a lot of people cried out for reform, and so that turned into the Progressive Era, where eventually Congress started to pass legislation to restrict them, starting with the Sherman Antitrust Act. They eventually also passed other pieces of antitrust legislation that would limit the activity of cartels or possible trusts, including things like cooperative agreements and collusion, working together into secretly sharing information that isn't open to the rest of the public with two different parties. I mean, it's okay if you're keeping it to yourself, but then to share it only between two parties is of course another form of collusion. Price discrimination. Now, some price discrimination is allowed, like selling tickets to different age groups for different prices. But if you're purposely doing it to squeeze out competition, then that is considered an antitrust violation and it's illegal. So all of these, of course, have been established by legislatures, including Congress, in order to stop unfair practice, domination of the marketplace, and a lack of competition, because that competition is what makes a marketplace efficient.